Chapter 5. Aylesbury, our new home. Our new house was situated on the Bedgrove housing estate in Aylesbury and was ready for us to move in April of 1963. However, before we left Wilstone, I had enjoyed riding a moped in an old orchard in the village. It belonged to a friend of Michael's, and I was allowed to ride this moped. It was a 50cc NSU Quickly and was kept in the orchard. Once we'd moved in our new home in Aylesbury, I was able to return to Wilstone and take the engine from the moped frame and put the engine in a homemade go-kart. I made this go-kart from builder's wood that I'd taken from the building site. I used the moped engine, a set of wheels from a child's tricycle, and various parts from a cement mixer. I then began to ride this machine around the new roads on the housing estate. However, I was eventually stopped by the local police, who warned me that it was illegal to ride this go-kart on the roads. And soon after that, a local newspaper came and gave me a write-up in the newspaper. Here it is, heading, David's Do-It-Yourself Go-Kart. And then, underneath, David's Do-It-Yourself Go-Kart 1963. An Aylesbury boy was able to return to school after his Easter holidays and tell his friends, I've made a homemade go-kart in the holidays. He's 14-year-old. On Sunday of last week, a friend gave David, pictured above, an old moped. As he was unable to ride it, as he was too young, he dismantled it. He then made a go-kart frame from pieces of wood, 4 wheels and a set of handlebars and a moped engine. Here's the moped. Within 3 days it was in working condition, and David estimates it will do 20 miles an hour. Incidentally, David, who has only lived in Aylesbury for a month, has very little interest in engines. His main hobby is in radio construction work, and one of his proudest possessions is a transistor radio which he built that is slightly larger than a matchbox. It was during this space of time, before starting my new school, I met another lad called Ian Mottram. We encouraged each other to steal push bikes. In fact, the first day I went to school, I stole a bike to come home from school on. I eventually got a Francis Barnett 150cc motorbike which my brother had stolen from the Aylesbury College with some other lads. I kept this in the field on the Bedgrove estate near our home. It was great fun to have a motorbike, and I used to ride across the fields to school and return home during the lunch hour. However, one day someone stole my motorbike, and Ian Mottram informed me that he thought he knew the person that had taken it. I went to that person's house early one morning during my paper round and found a motorbike in the garage. This wasn't my bike, but I took it anyway. I ended up being charged for garage breaking and was put on probation for a period of 2 years. Chapter 6. I meet Mrs. Knight and my teenage years leaving school. My first recollection of any religious person having any effect on my life was when I was about to leave school at the age of 15 years old. My mother had spoken to Mr. K.H. Knight, who was the proprietor of Central Bucks TV, and had arranged for me to have a part-time job working after school and on a Saturday. This was until I left school to take up full-time work as an apprentice for Mr. Knight. I'm told years later that my letter of job application was so badly written and the spelling so awful it was laughable. However, I was taken on despite my inability to read or spell, or use correct grammar, or read properly. This was during my last year at school. I first met Mrs. Grace Knight on Saturday morning, whilst working for her husband, Ken. She was on hot pursuit of her husband and shouting at him for doing something that she disapproved of. I was in the workshop with Norman Garrett, the other apprentice, and I thought, wow, what an awful dragon of a woman, and pitied Mr. Knight from that moment on. Through Mr. Knight, as Ken Knight, I was introduced to the radio and television servicing trade and often went with him on customers' houses to repair TV sets and install television aerials. I spent many hours with Ken, going to people's homes, and soon learned that he was not faithful to his wife. Not that it bothered me, as I knew what Grace was like from her first meeting. The idea of sexual promiscuity was very attractive to me. When we went round enjoying ourselves, Mrs. Knight would often be left at home in the workshop minding their 2 children, Alison and Mark. They also had a big dog called Rufus. By this time I had left school and was interested in our band, as I wanted to make music. Ian Mayer was the bass guitarist, and he built his own guitar amplifier from a circuit diagram that was published in the Wireless World. He built this amplifier and I helped him build a speaker cabinet, and we used this for future gigs. I soon began to realise the things I enjoyed were the things that Mrs. Knight did not approve of or found interesting. I thought she was a right killjoy and was boring. She was a Christian, whatever that meant, and I soon realised her values were not the same as mine. What I considered good and enjoyable, she would call it sin and sinful. She would often complain to her husband that I was always with him and he gave her no time. It seemed she was often driven to despair by him, never being in on time and being very unreliable, and would often leave her for hours whilst he was out working on jobs. On one occasion, Norma Garrett's mother complained to Mrs. Knight that Norman, her son, was not getting the training that he needed because Ken was always taking me out with him. I heard this conversation over the shop's intercom. Mrs. Knight said that I was a nuisance and she did not like me one bit, and it was not good that I should be out with her husband all the time. Upon hearing this, I felt angry and went down the stairs to where they were and confronted them, saying that I had overheard what they'd said about me. They were embarrassed, and I'm sure this did not help our relationship. I really thought Mrs. Knight was an ogre. I began to attend Luton College of Technology to learn about radio and television servicing, and travelled by bus 1 day a week from Aylesbury to Luton. It was about an hour and a half's journey. I think it must have been due to Mrs. Knight and her religion that I began to notice the texts of scripture put on what they call wayside pulpits. I began to memorise the verses such as, righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. And another, Jesus said, if you find life difficult, learn of me, and the burden that I will give you will not be too difficult to carry. At that time I had no idea of the meaning of these texts of scripture, but found it amusing to quote them to Mrs. Knight at any appropriate time or moment, thinking I would embarrass her. On one occasion I remember being dressed in an old blanket made into an undercoat for my brother's mod anorak. I was standing on the corner of the street near the workshop in Aylesbury one Saturday morning with Mr. and Mrs. Knight, and I quoted at the top of my voice these two scriptures in order to embarrass Mrs. Knight. I'm not sure how they felt about it, but little did I know that one day I would learn the truth of these texts and become a preacher of the gospel myself. Mrs. Grace Knight became a great help to me and lived until 2001. Here is a link to the video for her funeral entitled Obituary, Mrs. Maud Grace Knight. The full story is told in David Clarke's new book, released as Borstal Boys, available from amazon.co.uk and as an audiobook, or click like and comment to request further chapters.